Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 12. Down the Chimney. The old priest's finger pointed to one slave after the other. Besides Birth, 4 were selected for the torque ritual. None of them showed any emotion. Lund made no move, nor did he attempt by sign or thought to reassure his friend. There would be time to consider a course of action once their minds were clear and they were out of reach of the priests. The slaves, including the chosen, were herded out of the temple. Some still clutched their sides at the memory of the terrible pain. They were sent back to their cells as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The Vran were dazed after the sudden and devious display of power. They were still at the mercy of their masters, even if they had survived the final hunt. The greatest devotion and solidarity could not save the condemned. It was small consolation that the Torque had somehow misjudged them again, and identified the wrong man as their leader. If hope remained, it was seated firmly with this one, the champion who had inspired them in the forest, forged the slaves into a fighting force, struck down the oppressors as easily as splitting firewood. While he remained alive, there was a chance. Lund's thoughts were of a different nature altogether. The chosen slaves would have to be rescued, for he could not let Bruth take his place in whatever demonic rite was planned for them. Ever since their first meeting in the running trails, he had felt strangely responsible for the others' welfare. He could not simply shrug and walk away from this latest threat. As soon as the door of his cell slammed behind him, his mind turned towards the formulation of a plan. It no longer surprised him that he was willing to accept the possibility of defeating the masters at their own game. Had he not witnessed it, participated in it? Lund discovered that he believed in deliverance, in survival, in a struggle that would ultimately end in triumph. One small victory at a time. Deceive the slumbering beast. Let him believe he was in control. When the blow fell, it would not be expected. He needed to know when all the slaves would be gathered to the pits. If his suspicions were correct, and the rituals were planned for the Darkening, more than 10 days remained before the sacrifices would be needed. Any of these days could be the last for the Vran horde now inhabiting Grail. Birth and the others would have to be secured the very night before this day of extermination arrived. Otherwise, they would simply be hunted down and retaken. If they were among the slaves cast into the feeding pits, they would remain beyond the reach of the Torque. The chosen, once set free, could be taken to the caves down the chimney during that same night to await the arrival of the mass of fugitives in the morning. There was but one way to find out the exact time: Kor. For 2 days since the temple affair, Kor had been silent. This silence spoke not merely of distraction, but of absence. Lund felt deserted, fearing the worst. The old one who had been his salvation on many occasions could not last forever. Yet how he needed him now. If he could but remain to see them through the crisis ahead. Without his aid, the slaves would be virtually blinded to the activities above ground. They worked feverishly now to bring supplies down to the caverns by night. It seemed impossible that they should not be discovered, for dozens of slaves were involved during the final stages. Barrels and bags of provisions stored behind locked doors, wherever they could be reached, were emptied, filled with sand and resealed. Firewood was hauled down the chimney and piled in massive heaps. All the while, Lund considered the futility of his plan. Regardless of how much they could store underground, it would only be a temporary reprieve to hide in the caverns below. Eventually, the Torque would have to be confronted. Somehow the slaves would have to escape from Grail. While the others ported supplies, he searched for an inner passage that might eventually work its way towards the surface. He drew a rough map with charcoal, plotting the spidery course of dozens of tunnels, marking the dead ends, the crawling spaces that would have to be widened for further exploration, the places he could hear the underground stream the clearest. Once they were established in their holdout, they would have to break through to the water source, for it was impossible to store enough for so many mouths even for a 10-day. In the end, it was all too clear when the axe would fall. On the 6th day of leasing, all work in Grail was halted. Every last bronze slave, with the exception of Brith and the 4 other chosen ones, was herded together into the arena. There was not nearly enough floor space for so many, and more than half were eventually allowed to move up the stone steps to find a sleeping place among the spectator seats. A clumsy and half-hearted attempt was made at feeding the gathering. Groups of slaves were shepherded through the main entrance to fetch baskets of bread and cauldrons of watery soup. Lund made sure he was among these men, and while they stood around waiting at the open-air slave kitchen, slipped away among the rubble and forsaken canvas structures. He waited till it was thoroughly dark. The long inactivity made him shiver in the dry night air of early Genesis. The cooks shut down their operation and joined their fellows in the arena. Gates were locked and guards set for the night. Wandering keepers ambled round the high walls in 2s and 3s, making sure that no slave could escape that way without being spotted and the alarm raised. The Torque would not be caught a second time, even if there were few slaves now who could raise a weapon against them. The twin star peered at him from between the high parapets of the citadel, casting its ghostly light over the deserted field of broken buildings. Despairingly, not expecting a response, he turned his mind towards Kor. There was nothing to fill his thoughts but memories of what had been. He was still alone. If Brith had not been one of the captives, Lund would have found it almost impossible to locate the group inside the citadel. Despite the proximity of Torque priests, he risked searching for the familiar patterns of his friend's thoughts, aided by the knowledge that he was somewhere within the walls of the dark structure before him. Brith's response, if not as strong as usual, expressed his immense relief. For reasons unclear to Lund, he had believed the captives would be abandoned to their own devices, not being worth the great risk of an attempted rescue. They were not heavily guarded, he said. A single keeper, carrying the key to their prison, lazed on a stool not 5 yards away from the bars. The guardroom seemed deserted. Lund moved quickly, flitting from one hiding place to another, his breath steaming in the night air. When he was 20 yards away from the outer wall, he remained out of sight for a few moments to take stock. To the right the gateway loomed, with a new, stout wooden gate shut and barred. To the left the wall ran straight as an arrow, casting a shadow along the ground. There were no torches lining the parapet above, and none lit outside any of the shuttered windows and arrow slits. The slits were too narrow to allow him access, but the windows, if any of the shutters happened to be open. He inspected each one, holding his breath, but none appeared to be even fractionally ajar. The night was a cold one, of course, and the sleepers would desire to keep out the draught. He looked up again at the rim of the parapet, 80 feet above the ground. There was little choice. He would have to scale it. The wall would be dry and free of moss, since the wet season had not started yet. Casting a final furtive glance towards the gateway, he scurried over the open ground between his hideout and the fortress. His heart pounded in his ears as he inspected the wall for footholds. It was a jagged surface, with ample opportunity, but here and there a patch seemed smooth and dangerous. He would have to be careful, not to select a route that would leave him stranded in an impossible section. Climbing down would not be nearly as simple as ascending. He rubbed his hands together to rid his fingers of the numbing cold. The first few steps were easy enough, but soon the sweat started on his body, so he had to wipe his hands on his tunic to keep them dry. Lund worked his way towards a windowsill, wide enough to allow him a shallow seat. Once he reached it, he could rest his limbs and prepare the next climb. None of the shutters leaked light into the night. The rooms were either not in use or the occupants were fast asleep. The sill below the closed shutters was but an inch-wide ridge of stone. Lund placed both feet on it, pressed his body against the wood, and gripped around the top with his fingers. He transferred his weight to his legs and felt the strain lessen in his shoulders. He looked up. He was perhaps halfway there. Another good effort would bring him over the wall. He relaxed first one hand, then the other, while he plotted a course to the next line of shutters. He would have to move to his left in order to avoid a tricky stretch just below it. By the time he had a hand on the sill he had aimed for, the muscles of his arms and legs were quivering with the unusual exertion. He lingered a moment, stealing a glance upwards. His heart missed a beat. Something bulged between the crenellations at the top, something that ought not to be there. It was a man, his head clearly visible over the rim, the shape of his cloaked body lined against the stars where he leaned on the wall. If he looked down, Lund hoped fervently that the shadows were deep enough to make him invisible to the guard. He dared not move. The slightest noise might prompt a close investigation. At this height, he could not jump without severely injuring himself on the ground. There was no escape if he was discovered. He clung to the wall, his fingers and toes aching with the effort, his cheek pressed against the rough stone. Agonizing moments passed. The guard remained immobile. Lund knew he could not hang onto the wall much longer. He would have to risk pulling himself onto the sill or retreat to a lower one. Either way, it now seemed impossible to find a route into the citadel over the wall. He decided to go up rather than down, partly because his strength was failing quickly. The sill was wider than those lower down, and offered a good opportunity to regain his vigor. Muffled voices floated down to him. The guard had gained a companion. Lund stood hugging the shutters in exasperated silence. He shifted his weight ever so slightly, and experienced the giddy sensation of slipping away from the wall. One of the shutters had come away in his grip. The window had opened an inch. The dark interior lay beckoning. The room would almost certainly be occupied, since the shutter had not been fastened. He shuffled over to the fixed half and peered into the room. There was little to be seen of the sleeper, though he believed he heard the regular breathing one would expect. Surely the large bed held the form of some person. The bedclothes were ruffled and twisted to one side. His eyes fell on the stand next to the bed. A hooded robe, such as the priests wore, hung neatly suspended in midair, as if its occupant had but left it a moment before. Lifting the shutter to prevent the hinges from making a noise, Lund opened it wide enough for him to slip through. Once he was in the room and the night left outside, the breathing grew louder. He crept towards the door, and his only way of escape, every muscle tensed. It was bolted from inside. The heavy bolt resisted his efforts, till he had to use extreme force to move it. It slid open with a loud metallic click. Even before the voice rose in a sleepy question, he had opened and shut the door and was outside the room. His surroundings were unfamiliar. A mad dash to find a hiding place might deliver him straight into the arms of the guards. Still, it would not do to linger here undecided. He had to find a stairwell and descend into the bowels of the place. He dashed off into the dark passageway, his left hand touching the wall, ears pricked for the slightest sound of pursuit. Brith and the others were held below the storerooms of the western wing, in the notorious punishment cells. Lund had only a vague recollection of the layout, since he had been thinking of little else but survival whenever he had spent time there. It was a stark, bare place, filled with memories of brutality and pain. After gaining the lower levels that opened onto the courtyard, Lund was in more familiar territory. He worked his way through the maze of corridors, till the recognizable reek of the cells seeped out through barred doors and windows, and the stone walls were marked with rings of iron. The cobbled passage led steeply downwards, the silent darkness hostile and menacing. Lund slowed to a walk, drawing his breath deeply. One guard should be easy to subdue. The blow was not meant to kill, yet he could not be certain that the man still lived. There was no reason to risk having the alarm raised for the sake of the life of a filthy keeper. Yet it took all his resolve to strike a man from behind in cold blood. It was nothing like the urgent and compelling need of battle, though now just as necessary. The stool clattered to the floor as the weight of the slumped body overturned it. Lund grasped the leg to steady it, the slaves in the cell looking on with wide, frightened eyes. There was a noise behind him. He spun round in time to see the head of a man peering round the corner of the doorway. The keeper had not been alone after all. The man stepped out into the passage, a challenge already formed on his lips. Lund flung the stool at him, launching himself at the same time. The guard stumbled as he warded off the attack with his arm. Lund was on top of him, pressing down on his chest, a hand over his mouth. The man was tremendously strong. Even though Lund had him pinned in an awkward position, he was forcing his way out of the hold, prying the fingers away from his mouth. If he were to summon aid, their attempted escape would certainly be thwarted. Figures moved behind the struggling pair. The captives had dragged the body of the fallen guard to the bars, grasped the key, and freed themselves. Brith picked up the stool and brought it down with force on the man's head, knocking him senseless. Quickly they tied up the bodies and dragged them into the cell, Brith all the while carrying on a lively, if muted, conversation.
How did you get in?
Up the wall and through an open window on the top level. The ones that high are not barred.
And how do we get out?
The same way, I think. Though we'll use a rope and find a room without an occupant.
It was occupied.
A priest.
Brith stopped to stare at him.
A priest?
Lund nodded in response. His companion narrowed his eyes.
The gods favored you with a dangerous road, but I lent you enough good fortune to travel it.
They pilfered the guardroom of weapons, clothing, and edibles. Brith wanted to try the captured keys on the storeroom doors around them, but the rest were anxious to get away and would not linger. They had some distance to go before they would reach the relative safety of the tunnels. Grail was in an uproar once more. Disgraced and exiled to the lower halls beneath the citadel, Zabran could not help but enjoy the situation. He might be ignored and forgotten in this backwater, but it seemed he would not lack in entertainment. Poor Lord Groth had hardly congratulated himself on completing the temple on time and rounding up the remaining Viran in an orderly fashion, when this latest disaster overtook him. The captive slaves and their supposed ringleader had added insult to injury by breaking out of their prison. He smirked to himself. It might even be a good thing in the end, for it would have gone ill for the priests when the Great One realized that he had been offered another mediocre, potentially crippling sacrifice. Zabran frowned a little at his own predicament. It was too late now to point out the real troublemaker. If he would venture to do so, his action would only cause more blame to be heaped on his head, for why had he remained silent all this time? His hesitation would be seen as malicious spite, a direct betrayal of the Lord of all the Tour. In truth, it was little else. He yawned and stretched lazily. It was almost time for his feeding. First, he would surface to gaze upon the furious efforts of his replacement. Perhaps the intrepid Groth might still surprise them all. The new Master of Grail's imposing bulk all but blocked the narrow exit allowed the slaves from the arena. One by one they shuffled past, tentatively, heads bowed, not daring to glance at the image of frustrated fury towering over them. The smaller ones were hustled past quickly. He had no interest in them this day. Groth knew the ringleader and his fellows by sight. If they were in the arena, he would certainly recognize them. Not a single slave would escape his close scrutiny on their way out to join the others underground in the great court. At least this was the last time he had to endure the sight and the smell of them. By nightfall, the greater part of the riches would be a feast for the creatures of the pit. Long before the darkening, all the Viron slaves of Grail would be reduced to an unpleasant memory. The morning watch was spent before the last of the hags and feeble children had hobbled out through the gateway. Groth had ample time to calm down and consider why the escapees were not in the arena. He put himself in their place and instantly realized the futility of his search. It would have been supreme folly for the fugitives to rejoin the crowd here, for certainly the guards would discover them ere long. No, a far better place to conceal themselves would be the deserted fighting or running pits. Nevertheless, he ordered a thorough search of the place before he turned to leave. He would dispatch heavily armed warriors with hunting dogs to sweep the pits before dark. The escaped slaves, now threatening to destroy also his reputation, would not elude him for long. Zabran turned away in silence. He would not offer advice even to his former subordinate. Perhaps, soon enough, he would be called upon to do what he had been sent here for in the first place. Groth, for all his skill and experience, simply did not comprehend the situation. He had forgotten about the insidious listeners, or believed them eradicated. Did he really harbor the misconception that the slaves were unaware of their fate, of his plans for them? Had the dubious honor of his recent elevation robbed him of the last of his wit? Lund stationed the members of his band at intervals to cover the entire expanse of the great court. One of them had to accompany the first group selected for the pits, or there would be no one to lead the victims to the safety of the caverns beyond the roaning cages. He lingered in the center of the hall, closer to the chimney. Brennick and 3 others stayed close, ready to retrieve the rope ladders from the dark recesses where they had been hidden. Once the pandemonium in the feeding pits broke out, the slaves remaining here would have to be evacuated quickly before Groth realized what was happening and could bring all his force to bear to block their escape. The slaves were restless. They had not been fed since the morning, and some were beginning to suspect the purpose of their incarceration here. None of them knew exactly what horror waited just to the east of them, but some of the fear of the feeding pits had already spilled over into the great court. Here and there women paced up and down in an attempt to calm the small children in their arms. Most of the slaves were seated, leaning against the wall or one another, looking about them with nervous anticipation. None could remember a day where they had been gathered in such numbers for no apparent purpose, unless it had been for some severe transgression and punishment. Lund felt for the talon inside his tunic. The touch of the rough edge against his palm was reassuring, though the crude weapon had almost become a relic of earlier times. It was still easy to smuggle past the guards. He knew that the little blade could be worth more to him this day than ever before. The selection had started. A dozen keepers brandishing whips and drawn swords herded the slaves closest to the easternmost doorway through it and down the passage to the pits. They were loud and violent, as always, to prevent any thought of disobedience or tardiness to enter the minds of their victims. Nevertheless, many were reluctant to exit the hall, and those on the edges drew away instinctively to remain behind. Lund marveled at their seeming complacency. If no one intervened on their behalf, not a slave would lift a finger to avoid his doom. As the last of the chosen group disappeared into the passage, he slipped the curved claw into his hand. He nodded to Brennick and the others, and started making his way towards the doorway. Only 2 keepers remained there. They had not even closed the barred gate. 2 more lingered in the northern doorway, guarding the passage that eventually led to the surface. No doubt many others lurked beyond that in the guard rooms and tunnels. He had even heard the muffled barking of hunting dogs from the direction of the fighting pits. Either the Torque were searching there for Brith, or Groth expected trouble and had brought them out as a precaution. The guards looked at him as he approached. They seemed nervous also, and for good reason. Any moment now the submissive slaves would realize where they were heading, and the horror would spawn an overpowering panic, loosening their tongues in a way that no amount of whipping or threat of pain could stop. How would the thousands in the hall, nervously awaiting their turn, react to this? One of the men placed a hand on the hilt of his sword and stepped forward to challenge him. The other took hold of the gate as if to shut it forcibly, in case he should rush them. Lund looked away from them and squatted down on his haunches. He tightened his grip on the talon. The condemned slaves held their peace even as they passed the cages of the snarling animals on the higher level of the pit. The doors remained shut. It was still possible that they were merely being herded through this place of terror to be employed elsewhere. On the ramps to the lower levels, dread overtook the smaller ones, and they whimpered out loud and clung to their fellows. The large procession made many of the animals frantic and aggressive, though they shrieked and screamed in a rising cacophony of rage. The stained bars rattled under the impact of their bodies. The Viron closest to them shied away, slowing down the downward march. The apprehensive guards were driven to a frenzy of whipping and cursing. If the slaves halted, it would be extremely difficult to get them moving again. Soldiers joined the guards on the ramp. They leveled long spears at the rearmost ranks of the slaves and marched down at a steady pace. This action had the desired effect, for the hesitating slaves in front were shoved forward and away from the threat by those pressing from behind. Some were jostled up against the bars, howling with fright, but the pace had quickened to such a degree that they were swept down the ramp before any harm could come to them. Once the dark field of the Ronings had come into view, and the horror of their insatiable malice had touched the foremost of the Viron column, a one-sided struggle commenced to defy the will of the masters and the guards. Those first entering the place of death slowed instinctively, futilely resisting the flow, till all the painful conditioning that had shaped their habitual silence was forgotten in their frantic fear, and they screamed unintelligible warnings, igniting the latent terror of the rest. Yet there was no stopping the downward rush. The warriors behind quickened their pace, driving the horde before them like sheep. Only when they in turn reached the tall gates of the Ronin pit did the halt be secured with a lock and heavy chain. The unfortunates trapped inside clambered over one another to grip the bars in vain, their reason overthrown. Others rushed into the darkness of the cavern, searching for escape. Many huddled on the floor, too petrified to move any further. But one slave seemed strangely unaffected, though he was certainly nervous and fearful. In the press of bodies, the shouting and shoving, no one took any notice of this odd behavior, nor of the fact that he happened to wear the mark of a branding iron on his upper arm. Above the milling slaves in the lowest feeding pit, from the relative safety of the upper level, a burly tour sergeant shouted an order to 10 guards standing at the ready. As one man they leaned into their task, turning a massive wooden wheel, tightening, then stretching the thick rope and heavy pulleys. Slowly, protesting loudly, the ropes lifted the strong chains attached to them, and then, unexpectedly, they were stuck. The sergeant cursed and frowned on his men. They leaned back and doubled their efforts. The chains jerked free. The cage doors opened. Or they should have opened. Something was wrong. The large tour leaned forward, his eyes piercing the dark below. The doors on the third level were still shut. Yet above the tumult and screaming he could hear the metallic creaking of opening cages. He had barely realized the truth when the world behind him exploded in snarling ferocity. There was time for one quick command and the drawing of his sword before the beasts were upon them. All the cages of the upper levels lay open, their former occupants rushing over the ramp and up the passages, attacking the guards. He knew what he saw was not possible. He wanted to curse the men for this catastrophic error. He wanted to understand how the locking pins on all the cages could have broken at the same time, or how the wheel for the third level could open cages on the other levels instead. But there was no opportunity for any of this. His confusing thoughts were torn away but moments after the sword from his hand. The distant screaming echoed up the passage and spilled into the great court. A ripple passed through the seated multitude. Their fears and suspicions had found a voice. The guards at both exits slammed the gates almost simultaneously, nervously dragging the chains and locks into place. Lund slipped a talon back into his tunic and signaled to his band. A dozen of them rushed the gates. Several other slaves in the proximity joined in, though the doorways were crowded and the guards' view of the hall obscured. Though the terrible screaming from below had gained in intensity, the court was still eerily quiet. The rope ladders were rolled out, lowered, and fastened below by Brith's group. The wide-eyed slaves needed little goading to start the downward exodus. Urgently, but without hurrying, they made the dangerous descent into the chimney, the branded youths at the top catching out the feeble and the very young. One old man or small child could slow the movement on an entire ladder. It was far better to place all the potentially slow movers on the same one. The shouting from the feeding pits had taken on a different quality now. Lund breathed a sigh of relief when he noticed this, for it was the proof he needed of the successful execution of his plan. There were other voices, Torque voices, calling for assistance, some wild with panic, interlaced with the snarling and howling of wild beasts. The guards at the eastern doorway, with no way out but through the slave-filled court or the feeding pits, abandoned the gate and rushed down to the aid of their comrades. Those at the northern doorway proved more prudent, disappearing into the guard room to sound the alarm. Lund grinned with satisfaction. Whatever help would arrive would soon be preoccupied with containing the beasts escaping onto the streets of Grail, paying no attention to the slaves securely locked in the court. There would be ample time to escape unhindered. He fervently hoped that the poor slaves in the pit had been able to find their way among the cages of the Ronings to safety in the caverns below. He was the last to leave the hall. The screaming from the pits had ceased long before. Faint echoes of shouting from outside still floated down the passages from time to time. The Torque had their hands full with exterminating the agitated beasts. There was no sign of any guard. He loosened the ladders, till only one, secured with a rope and a slipknot from below, remained. The slaves had vanished from the great court, down to the last ragged bundle and worn shoestring. He gripped the ladder and clambered into the pit. The simple part of his plan was complete. Brith stood on the large rocky platform, looking over the sea of faces just below him. The slaves were quiet, awed by the bold and unforeseen escape, staring up at him as if he had been the one to deliver them. While he waited for Lund to arrive, he spoke to them reassuringly, pointing out the stock of supplies, the difficulties the Torque would have in reaching them, the size and number of nearby caverns. They had tools and a few weapons. There was water and the hope for more. Finally, he informed the hushed crowd that their fellows had not been destroyed in the feeding pits, that they were safe and would soon be reunited. When he paused, there were questions or quivering voices raised in grateful wonder. Lund's band stood to one side, an air of purpose setting them apart. Their evident complicity and knowledge of the goings-on elevated them to co-deliverers, champions who had enough daring and skill to resist the schemes of the Torque and be triumphant. When Lund appeared on the platform behind Bruth, an old man seated close to the front rose to his feet. His voice was clear and strong, sounding the question in everyone's mind.
Who will lead us?
All the heads turned to face him. Without hesitation, Brennick stepped forward from among the band. His young voice filled the eager silence.
Lund.
Bruth spoke almost simultaneously, a deeper echo of the same word. There was a stir at this uttering, as several forms tried to move through the press of bodies to where the voices had spoken. A young woman's cry rose among them.
He is alive? He's here?
Many others took up the sounding of the name, a name they had heard before, had dared to whisper to one another when times were hard. The caverns echoed with it, a rumbling of many voices, so seldom heard and never before raised in hope. The old man lifted his arm, and Bruth did the same to silence the crowd. Another question rang out in the cavern.
And why should he lead us?
The band stirred at this, casting angry looks in his direction, but Bruth was grateful for the opportunity to answer.
Without him, you would still be waiting your turn up there,
He pointed towards the chimney.
to be consumed by the Torque beasts. This is his discovery and his preparation. But he is not merely one to scheme in the dark, for he is the slayer of many hunters, the survivor of the running trails, the royal hunt, the uprising of Grail.
Bruth was warming to his task. His voice rose.
One to rescue the condemned, save the doomed from the horror of the Torque.
Lund stepped forward, touched his arm, and whispered urgently into his ear.
That's enough now, Bruth.
Yet now the slaves caught sight of such a hero. A ragged cheer broke from them, who had never done so before. As soon as it passed, the old man was heard once more.
But he's a youth. What wisdom could he have?
Lund stepped forward now, to answer for himself. He looked directly at the man, not in challenge, but in sympathy and understanding. His voice was forceful but calm.
The wisdom of many battles, of survival, of suffering. The wisdom gained by the unforeseen guidance of Kor, by the selfless sacrifice of others, by the coursing of the Vron blood within me, by the gift and favor of the gods who would not let me die, but also by the good counsel of others of experience and worth.
The meaning of these last words was not lost on the man. He nodded in satisfaction. Lund waited for more questions. When no one else stirred, he merely said,
I will lead as long as I am able. I will require of you to do the best that you can for the good of everyone. There will be no oath. Each one will follow as long as he chooses to. If I find my way to the light, I will share it with the smallest and feeblest of you. That is my promise.
He stepped down from the platform to move among them. The slaves rose, young and old, to see him, to touch him, as if to reassure themselves that what they had witnessed was not merely a dream that would fade on waking. The champion was real, and he would fight for them. He would strike the unimaginable blows against the terror of their masters. In the middle of the pressing multitude he found her, whose voice he had heard earlier at the mention of his name. Ceridwen, radiant with excitement, gripped his hands till he believed she meant to crush them. For once she could not find a word to say. He drew her trembling body towards him, enfolding it in his arms. He pressed her cheek to his, feeling the damp touch of her sudden tears. Her words stumbled over one another.
I searched for you. When I came here, days and days, you had to be dead, for I could not reach you.
Lund pushed her away, holding her at arm's length.
No,
He smiled.
Kor shielded me from the Torque.
There were 2 boys with her, and the bent form of an aged man. The boys he recognized instantly from the tanning yard. Their wide-eyed stares of gratitude when he had struck down their tormentor were with him still. He had seen it in the eyes of others, an unreserved appreciation. Now the look was more intense, if anything, for they had hardly expected to see him again. They gripped his hand in turn, almost shyly whispering their names, Rin and Kevik. Lund knew the fair one, Run, was a close relation, for he had heard the boy's panicked thoughts back in the tanning yard. Such a contact could be useful. He would give them to the veteran Brennick and send them exploring at the first opportunity. He turned to the graybeard. There was recognition in the old man's eyes.
You are Lund?
There was wonder in the voice.
I am Lathan of the farm clearing. We never met.
He gripped a feeble old hand.
I owe you a great debt. Without your aid, I would certainly have perished.
Lathan smiled and nodded. Lund glanced from him to Ceridwen, looking on with the same smile. He understood now what had preserved the spirit in the farm clearing. The old men among the slaves worked their particular magic in silence and secrecy, and now they had given him the chance to work the miracle for all the hopeless. There was no time to be idle. He was not sure how the Torque would react to this bold move. What could they do but wait it out? Following the slaves down the chimney in force might very well prove disastrous. They were probably not aware of the true extent and layout of the caverns below the great court. From the evident sabotage of their cages in the pits, it would be clear that the Vran had not retreated here in a desperate attempt at escaping, but rather as a result of careful thought and preparation. They would have to allow for the fact that there might be an escape route into the forest. Scouts and roaming bands of significant strength would have to be deployed all around the city wall, guarding against the breakout. How many men would remain to assault the impregnable position of the slaves, or attempt to dig them out? It would be a tempting proposition simply to let them remain in their den until they starved. Whatever course of action they decided on, Lund would not merely wait to counter it. There was many a difficulty with which to deal. The Vran trapped behind the roaming lair was the most urgent matter of all. Their hiding place would be discovered ere long, and even if they managed to escape detection, there was too little in the way of supplies to sustain them. They would have to be rescued as soon as possible. Linking up with the caverns there would also give the slaves access to the outside, even if that meant they had to crawl through the feeding pit. Water was the key. They had heard the whisperings of a stream when exploring the hideout, and without doubt the trickling sound that teased them in these caverns were from the same source. They had to find the water, follow it upstream, and break through to the trapped slaves. Explorers were needed, boys of Brennick size and ability, worming their way through the rock to find the end of every burrow. There were miners enough among them now, old ones and boys who had ample experience with the pick and rock hammer. The feeding and care of the multitude he would leave to Lathan. The greater part of the slaves knew him from the farm clearing, and would trust the old man to be fair with the distribution of their meager supplies. This arrangement left him free to organize the defense. In addition to his 24 branded survivors, Lund selected another 40 boys of at least 15 cycles as his frontline soldiers. Only half of these had any form of stabbing weapon, but more importantly, they were all furnished with 10-foot staves of light, sturdy construction. In the struggle to come, these would prove far more useful than the finest blades. The men and boys from the mines, numbering about 800 useful individuals, he kept in reserve if the invaders should gain a foothold. Organized into bands of 50, the miners had nothing with which to repel the attack but their bare hands, and a few tools of their trade that had previously been smuggled down into the hideout. These would be employed at some distance from the entrance as the workers passed them from one shift to another in their struggle to break through to the feeding pits. Only once things turned desperate for the defenders would the reserve be cast into the battle. With the inadequate state of men and material in mind, Lund set about fortifying his position. The outer ledges, allowing the only known entrance into the caverns beyond, were smeared with animal grease. Protrusions of rock were chipped away to deny the enemy a hold for hand or foot. Loose stones were piled inside the entrance to be used as missiles. Finally, a palisade was constructed of all the firewood they possessed. If all was lost, and the defenders of the mouth were overcome, it could be set alight and shoved forward with poles to clear the ledge. The attack came during the night. Long ropes, soaked in pitch, were lowered into the pit and set alight. The Southlander warriors were almost blind in the deep darkness underground, and these blazing serpents would aid them in discovering the hideout of their escaped quarry. Men were lowered into the chimney, a little stretch at a time, calling out as they went. Hardly waiting for these occasional reports, eager exterminators clambered after them on hastily constructed rope ladders. Archers lined the rim of the chimney in the great court, but since the slaves did not venture out onto the ledges outside the lair, they had no opportunity of finding a target. Lund and his defenders made no move till the enemy warriors were struggling for footing on the greased ledges. A quick rush sent the first attackers screaming over the edge, with 3 or 4 grabbing hold of the ladders to save themselves. There they hovered, precariously, cursed by the scores above them to leap down, yet realizing that the chances of survival if they should do so were slim. Groth's voice bellowed from the safety of the great court, reverberating in the narrow space. At this, another attempt was made, half-hearted and doomed. It cost the attackers 11 more men, slipping away into the dark without striking a blow. A retreat was ordered, followed by an ineffectual barrage by the archers. Shortly, there was nothing but the silence and the stink of charred rope to testify of the engagement. Lund set a watch and ordered the excited band to get some rest. It had been a profitable night's work for the slaves. They had gained a captured sword, 3 arrows, and an enormous lift in confidence. Brith was placed in charge of mapping the caverns. It was his particular task to weave all the information brought in by scouts and explorers into a coherent whole. He set the priorities for the mining squads and sent groups of explorers out with particular goals in mind. Within 3 days, he had a clear picture of the network of caverns and tunnels. The streamlet had been located, and the miners were well on their way tunneling to the feeding pits. The supply of water, though not ample, solved one of their more pressing problems. At least the number of days they could now hope to hold out underground was extended beyond 10. Brith carved his map with meticulous care on a smooth section of the cavern wall. Round the main halls, the myriad of narrowed tunnels and passageways grew, spreading further and further every day. Many soon petered out into dead ends or became too tight for exploration. These he marked with a double line. The untidy spider web of tunnels was gradually sealed off in this manner in all but 2 places. The first had been rendered virtually impossible by a heavy rock fall in times past, and could only be fully explored once the miners were freed from their present employment. The other wound its way into one dangerous fissure after another, forcing the intrepid explorer to tiptoe around the edges or be lowered by his mates in the hope of reaching a ledge in the blackness below. 5 days after the escape, the miners finally broke through to the feeding pits. They had labored day and night in shifts, wearing out several of the tools in their effort to reach the trapped, starving slaves below the Roning pit. Though pale, weak, and fearful, the rescued ones reached their fellows without the loss of a single child. Lund was touched by the open display of gratitude from these wretches, who had seen the horrible end intended for them face to face. The days of cold and darkness had almost seemed a comfort after the terror of the pit and their unlooked-for escape. Lund's man had reassured them that help was at hand, that a champion had risen among them to withstand the masters. Once they had heard the sounds of the miners working their way towards them, no one had thought of death anymore. Now they crowded round him, eager to touch him and be touched in turn. There were many little ones among them with bright, hopeful eyes, staring at him as if he was something more than a man. At that moment, he believed that for their sake he could be. The Torque Master was up to something. Lund was convinced that the blustering, violent Lord Groth would not be content with waiting for the slaves to starve. The warriors in the great court did little more than loose an occasional shaft at the imagined moving of a slave below. It certainly seemed that there was nothing else for them to do, that the slaves had found an impregnable refuge. Yet the Vran defenders remained in place, ever vigilant, taking turns to watch the chimney for any sign of activity. It was difficult to tell the difference between night and day in the caverns, except at the very entrance, where a subtle shift in the darkness announced the rising and setting of the sun far above. The parties of explorers returned almost unerringly at dusk, to make their reports, receive the scanty meal, and rest their tired bodies. No doubt the smell of cooking helped them to determine the end of the day. Lund joined in as they lined up to report at Brith's wall. He had to keep abreast of the discoveries made. Soon they would have to find a way out of the caverns, a secret way far from the Torque guards. There were far too many slaves, too many vulnerable and weak children, to attempt to break out through the feeding pits. An armed party of warriors would find it hard to escape that way, and in the process reveal the tunnel leading to the main body underground. If they could not find an alternative route, it would simply be a matter of time before every last slave would perish. He saw Brennick excitedly waiting his turn to speak. It was not merely the rumbling of his empty stomach and the maddening aroma of a warm meal that prompted the boy's impatience this night. He had found something important. While Brith made adjustments to his map, Lund took Brennick aside to hear the news. The boys' group had explored the impossible sections still unsealed on the wall map. They had moved rubble all day long for lack of something else to do. Just before it was time to return, they had managed to dislodge a large stone, creating a gap in the obstruction. Brennick had crept into it to see what was on the other side. In the tight space he had forgotten himself, not hearing the others' repeated calls, not reaching for the offered torch to light his way. They had dragged him out by the legs, shivering and confused. The strangeness was with him still, in his gaze and his uncertain tone.
The air moved like a wind, and it smelled like the forest, but there was no light, and... His eyes grew large. Lund felt a little of the boy's wonder and apprehension rub off on him.
And what?
It is a strange place beyond the gap. There are ghosts moving about. I wanted to go in, but I couldn't, and I couldn't get out either.
Lund might have shrugged off Brennick's odd claim as the fearful conjecture of a young boy, but this same child had forgotten his fear in the face of mortal peril, and had braved a roaming pit by himself. If he did not dare enter a passageway, it was significant. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The trembling ceased. There was but one thing to do.
Tomorrow you will show me this place.
Lund stirred uneasily in his sleep. Half-forgotten images tumbled over one another in his mind, competing for dominance, till the whirling multitude pressed him into wakefulness. He sat up with a sigh of exasperation. Around him, many of the sleeping figures, packed together against the cold, moved about restlessly, trying to find a place of comfort on the rocky floor. The cavern just inside the entrance from the chimney was the largest of all, and housed the defenders, the miners, the explorers, and about 200 more who still desired to belong to any of these groups. 3 small fires lit the inside of the cavern, but provided little warmth for the occupants, who had nothing but their threadbare clothes to keep out the chill. What blankets had been brought down with the slaves had gone to the smallest children and infants. Lund gazed at the red glow and moving shadows cast on the cave walls. His thoughts turned to the fragments of dreams still lingering in his memory. He frowned. Something pressed for recognition. A far-off call, faint but urgent. A shiver rushed up his spine. On the far wall, a familiar form grew from the shadows, massive, reaching to the rough dome of the roof, a pair of open wings. Surely he imagined it. The amber of the low flames flared as if in a sudden breeze, streaming upwards with a roar of vitality. He leaped to his feet, fire in his eyes and in his mind, stumbling over the prostrate, sleeping forms of Rin and Brennick. He was on hands and knees, unable to hold on to the dream. Behind him the boys' voices rose. The darkness closed in about them once more as the brightness receded, leaving him to answer their sharp complaints in the dull, lifeless glow of before. Lund was troubled by the memory of the apparition. All the way to the gap, only half listening to the excited chatter of the exploring band, he could think of nothing else. When they reached the blocked section, he was nervous and on edge, glancing about him suspiciously. Something out of the ordinary was at work in this place, watching and waiting, beyond the senses of the body, at the same time beckoning and aloof. The boys fell silent. Brennick alone clambered up to the crawling space they had cleared the day before. He was trembling again, though trying his utmost not to show it. Lund handed him the torch, pressed past him and into the gap. There was no trace of movement in the air. The place was musty and dank, reeking of decay. Perhaps the spores of some cave fungus carried in the ancient air, now the cavern beyond had been reopened, could account for the odd feeling sweeping over him, and for the strange tales Brennick had told the night before. Ghosts, what a thought. Once his shoulders were through, the gap widened sufficiently to allow for crawling. He reached for the torch. The shadows leaped back as he brought it forward. Beyond the fallen rock, a passage led through a rough, arched doorway into the dark of what had been a sizable cavern. A slight noise ahead gave him a violent start. Had it been falling rock? He froze, listening intently. There it was again. Had someone called his name? He glanced behind him, but there was no sign of Brennick. Of course, the sound did not come from behind, but from the strange shadow beyond the gaping doorway. Carefully, with a flaring torch in front of him like a shield, Lund climbed over the rubble into the passage proper. He became aware of his own hard breathing. For a moment he wondered if there was bad air in this hole, but the torch flame still burned brightly. Involuntarily, his pace slowed till he was inching forward, placing one foot in front of the other only when he had inspected the rubble-strewn floor with care. He had the impression of stalking a sleeping beast, one that might wake at the slightest disturbance. He crept to the doorway. Now there was a stirring, a touch upon his skin, an awe rising from within, forcing his breathing ever shallower. The beckoning grew stronger, almost irresistible. An unfamiliar aroma permeated the air, foreign fields fanned by a nameless breeze, and over all the faraway roaring of great waters. The torchlight sparked reflections in 1,000 facets of leaping fire. A host of amber eyes hovered over spiking blazes of blue, casting illumination from wall to wall, till he had to shield his face with a raised arm. Still he moved forward, into the brightness, his hunger for the unknown powers that so mocked his perceptions, far stronger than his apprehension. The rough stone walls became visible, and with it an array of helms, crested, full-faced, crowned, resting on jagged reaches of rock, empty eye sockets reflecting the light of ages beyond the reach of memory. There were broken wings and clasps of golden hue, fallen away from long-gone leather straps. Strange, colorless inlays of crystal in patterns unknown yet impossibly familiar. His bare feet touched the wooden shaft of the spear. He turned his head in wonderment. Scattered among the loose rocks of the cavern lay piled weapons of many designs and descriptions. Short swords, daggers, curved and straight spears, maces. The torchlight played among the faceted blades, caught up here and there in reflections of bright blues and greens, glittering like so many starry jewels. Something was moving in his chest. His breath was coming too quickly. On a rough stone table lay a naked blade, isolated from any other weapon, the blue fire flowing from it in quiet waves that washed around the walls. An echoing whisper broke from his thoughts.
Touch it. Claim it.
He took a stumbling step towards the table. He was young, strong, and worthy. He would answer the call. It was his breath, his life, and his destiny. Lund stepped forward boldly and grasped the hilt with both hands. An old man, stooped and worn away, had him by the hand. The words fell away from the figure's mouth like pebbles into a well.
I cannot take you any further.
The grip faded. He was lost in the lethal mists of the dank wood, yet not alone. Shadows stood up about him, touched him in encouragement. He recognized several of them: Brithale, Lurian, Brennick, Seritwin, smiling, dancing on a field of sunlight and white flowers. But the winged shadow fell over all, the destroyer, foul and irresistible. There were screams, children in the anguish of painful death, and he had to run. He would run, even if it meant his destruction in the jaws of terror. A wall of fire rose before him, and the wailing snarl of many beasts pressed from all around. A great man, a Vran he had seen outside the line, touched him with a crown of gold. His eyes were sunken and weary. A buffeting wind swirled about him, Kinslayer, and then like a ray of light, he tasted the madness of battle, till he thought it would never let him go again. The voice cut through the red blur of violent pain. It was the cooling touch of sanity, a balm that soothes the mind into calm clarity. Gone were the claw demons of his nightmare. His breathing had slowed again, though he felt oddly disembodied, as if the flesh he stood up in was a foreign thing. Around him the stars whirled in a clear sky. His feet were planted in soft white sand, the air about him warm but fresh, carrying the scent of sun-tide flowers. A few paces away stood the winged man of his dream. Lund dropped to his knees. His heart was drumming wildly. He was awake. This was real. Power touched him, and meaning flowed into his mind.
You are tested beyond any requirement of the course. You know yourself and the burden of your calling. Rise up. Take up your blade.
Lund obeyed. The weapon seemed light in his hands. The voice reached out again, surrounding him.
You have claimed it. Will you wield it? Even if the wielding claims your life in the end.
He moved his heavy tongue. His heart and soul was in his answer.
I will wield it, if it gives me power to save the people. My life was preserved for that purpose.
Someone was calling his name, over and over again. The young voice sounded frantic with concern, even tearful. Slowly memory returned. Brennick. The boy had ventured into the passage, trembling but resolute. Beyond him there were other voices. His companions were trying to call him back. Lund rolled onto his stomach. The blade clutched tightly to his chest. Despite the splitting ache in his temples, he felt ecstatic and light as air. The hundreds of prayers, the lonely nights of pale fear, the quick pleading gasps at the end of exhaustion. He had found the end of it all, or it had found him. He raised up on hands and knees. There was a gasp from the direction of the doorway through which he had entered. He looked up into Brennick's wide eyes.
What is wrong? Are you hurt?
The boy glanced about him disbelievingly. Lund almost smiled through the pain. Surely Brennick had to sense something of the pull, the irresistible call flowing from this mysterious place. Had the winged man a gift for someone so young? The torch he had dropped without noticing shortly after entering was still burning on the floor of the cavern. He picked it up and the smoldering flame flared up once more. At once light leaped from all around him, and he was as breathless and overawed as the staring boy.
What is it?
Brennick's whisper was hoarse and barely audible. Lund gestured with a torch.
Come here.
The boy took a few tentative steps till he stood next to him.
Do you feel it? The pull?
Brennick nodded, speechless.
You should wait here, perhaps, till he calls your name. It is not a ghost at all.
He thrust the torch at the boy, who took it automatically.
Do not be afraid. I will wait for you on the other side of the fall.
He could see the quick pulsing of the boy's heartbeat. Brennick's large eyes followed him as he moved away. A tiny whisper followed after him.
Who is it?
It is our salvation. Come just in time.
Outside, beyond the gap, 5 boys waited in the dark. His sudden appearance almost sent them scurrying back to Brith with a crazy notion that Lund and Brennick had been taken by the ghost, who now followed close behind. but Rin recognized his voice as he called after them, and the five came back looking embarrassed. He showed them the gift from the winged man. The light of it sparkled in their eager eyes. Dirty fingers traced the line of its molded perfection, till they forgot about Brennick and their fear. Questions rose up round him. Where could they get such a treasure? Were there more of these in the ghost man's cave? What had he seen in there? Did he make the blue fire they had seen through the hole? They had heard him calling out, but they weren't sure. Then they remembered. Was Brennick still in there? Had the ghost man gotten him? Yes, he told them. The ghost man had gotten him, and he had gotten the ghost man, and would come away with a gift and a message he would never forget. Grith waited at his wall map. As soon as he looked up and saw Lund walking among the excited little troop of boys, he knew that something very significant had taken place. Lund walked differently, as if he had trouble seeing clearly, with an arm round the shoulders of one of the boys, while the crowd galloped about him in their wild abandon. It was Brennick, walking in an uncharacteristic slumped way. Had the boy been hurt? Grith waited till they came close. There seemed to be little change in the appearance of his friend, but the set of his mouth, the sloping of his shoulder, the light in his eyes, and a dozen tiny shifts in the way he moved made him almost seem a stranger. Grith felt the shivers run up his spine. Brennick's face was tear-stained and downcast, but the strangeness of Lund had attached itself to him also. When he looked up at last and met Grith's gaze, there was a strong suggestion that he was seeing him for the first time. They halted in front of him. The other boys were babbling excitedly. Rin waved the torch about in an irritating fashion, till Grith ordered them to stand still and stop their yapping. Lund held out an object. Grith could not believe his eyes. It had the appearance of a long dagger, though the large hilt suggested that it was much more than that. The length of it from tip to pommel was perhaps 18 inches of transparent glass that caught the torchlight in a magical way, reflecting it from one facet to another in bluish brilliance. The leather of the grip had completely disintegrated. Yet, even without this hint, he could sense the extreme age of the weapon, along with its pulsing mystery. Nothing about it was ordinary or even familiar. His eyes could not capture or measure the potential locked in these sublime lines. This was the blade of a god. He spoke in awed tones.
I have never seen anything as beautiful as this. Still, it is small for a sword. How do you open it?
Lund placed his hand on the hilt and lifted the blade.
When the time comes, it will open itself.
Only once they had stretched out on their rocky beds that night did he try to explore what had taken place. The call had been real. The gift lay here at his side. Even more than that, he had seen things that were true and yet not accomplished. If he would heed the visions, the warnings and the portents might aid him in achieving what he so desired, what he was purposed to achieve. A link had been established with something greater than the bronze slave community, greater than Kor even, more ancient and enduring than time itself. Knowledge had come to him, realization of belonging and identity that no mortal father could bestow on his son. Lund was more than a frightened child, treading skins in the rinsing vat. He was more than a terror-stricken boy, fleeing the lash in the running trails. He was more than a slave selected to die for the entertainment of his masters. He was even more than a man. He listened to the quiet breathing all around him. All this life, faces fleetingly familiar or well-known, all bound together in the struggle for survival, the common claim of living without brutality and fear, so long denied. They were his people. He sighed with satisfaction. That was how he wanted it. Brennick's whisper was close to his ear.
You cannot sleep?
Not yet.
Me too. I have the dream in my mind.
Lund turned towards the boy.
It is more than a dream. It is shadows of real things. Some of these I have already seen. The others I know will be.
Brennick rose up on an elbow. His eyes were bright in the half-dark.
We have the gifts. They are real.
They are. The blade he gave you, it was different to the others?
Yes. I knew that it was mine, and when I touched it, I was taken away to that strange place, to the man who knew my name, and he showed me many things. You were in my dream, and the girl from the clearing who knows you.
Lund smiled.
You were in mine, and so was she.
Brennick's eyes were serious. He looked as if something that had escaped him up till then was finally within his grasp. He spoke his next words with complete assurance.
We are not going to die. Not here. I know this now.
He told you this?
I saw it. Strange places I've never seen. A great stretch without trees, covered in water and low plants, and a dusty city. I saw people like us, Ron, a boy and a man, but not slaves. How could I see such things if I was going to die here?
Lund had entertained these thoughts also. Even if he did not share the boy's certainty, there was something in what he had said.
You are right. I have felt my death come close many times in the forest and in the cells, but never did it take me. I would wake again, somehow still alive. Now I know it waits for me in a faraway place on a field of battle, where I will face my enemy as a man and not a beast.
He wanted to believe it. Yet a doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Perhaps if he was careless and acted in a foolish manner, there would be no such day for him. The opportunity would pass him by if he was to fall in these caverns of Grail. They brought the greater part of the weapons and armor from the cavern during the next day. Most everything was in need of attention and repair. Straps and grips were gone, scabbards warped and brittle with extreme age. Alone the spears, about 150 in number, could be doled out to the defenders for immediate use. The chrysolite heads made them light enough for the youthful warriors to handle, though the length caused them to be a little unwieldy. Lund was surprised at the lack of body armor. Row upon row of helms were spaced out on the cavern floor in front of him, all fashioned from domed steel or thinly plated gold and brass, the metal too thin to withstand anything but a glancing blow. Ornamental inlays of the same crystal substance used in the blades decorated the sides and crests as if they had been part of the mold. Evidence remained of greaves, girdles, and bracers, all of hardened leather, with similar patterned inlays to those on the helms, but not a single piece existed to cover the chest, back, or groin. There were amulets of crystal in many designs, some on perished plaited leather thongs, others attached with tiny clasps to chains of gold or silver, with links so small and delicate it defied belief. What the functions of these jewels were, he could only guess. Yet there was something of the blade's hidden potency crafted into these objects, as if they belonged with one another. Ceridwen had taken charge of the younger children. Her vivacity, her joy, and unquenchable spirit were infectious, and they trooped about her all the day long if she allowed them. But the clearing girl, with her thirst for knowledge, would not have them idle away the time, even if they were trapped in the tunnels without hope for a tomorrow. Quickly she had searched out the older men and women to instruct groups of children in writing and reading, as much in an attempt to keep them from being underfoot as in the hope that they might learn something. With Lathan's aid, she set up structures of extended households so that everyone belonged somewhere, and there were adults responsible to account for the last little one. Clothing and blankets were distributed evenly, and places designated downstream for regular washing. They were not savages after all, despite what the masters had tried to make them. So efficient and extensive were her efforts that Brannick and several other boys came to complain to Lund. Ceridwen had invaded the warriors' quarters and insisted on a cleanup. They did not mind the washing or the stashing away of bedrolls and belongings, but now she would have them trim their hair and mend the tears in their ragged clothing. Lund smiled and shrugged, stating that she was in the right. He could not face the Torque with scarecrows at his side. A man had to be able to see clearly before he could strike down an enemy. They squealed that he was partial to her, and that the Vran host was now to be run by a woman. He jumped after them at this, shouting that if they did not have their stinking, scraggly frames seen to that moment, he would have all the old maids set on them with scrubbing brushes. The days had darkened at the end of another cycle. Lund knew there would soon be a shortage of food. Too many mouths were waiting for the daily ration. They had been all too successful in their efforts to save the multitude of slaves. Nobody would ever have guessed there to be so many. An attempt would have to be made to gather supplies from Grail. He would take a party through the Roning lair to the surface. Under cover of dark, they would snoop around, scavenging for anything edible. Berth and another group would linger just inside the lower cavern, in case the marauders were trapped and needed aid, or there was too much loot for them to carry away at once. The attempt would be made between the third and fourth watch, when vigilance was at its lowest. The cages seemed secure, but it was difficult to tell. The Ronings were quiet, tense. Brannick moved forward at a trot. The blade was sheathed behind his back in order not to interfere with his running. Though he was armed and confident, Lund had warned him not to consider a confrontation with the keepers, not even to save the life of a companion. Something of Kor's fear for the safety of a young ward had pushed him to force this promise from the boy. 7 figures snaked after him, keeping their eyes fixed on the heels of the person in front, as instructed. Lund went lost, ignoring the welling of fear as he passed between the cells. The anger beat at him. They were starving. Not enough cattle remained in the pens to satisfy their massive appetites. No doubt the sight of prey passing so close to them had to be maddening in the extreme. The animal pens on the upper levels were deserted. No attempt had been made to recapture any of the escaped beasts. They had been exterminated and their carcasses left to rot where they fell. Lund was grateful for this. Rest of beasts here could easily have betrayed their presence to the guards. They kept to the deepest shadows, lingering at the exit while Lund crept forward to scout. The passages to left and right seemed quiet. There was no one in sight. Even the smell from the cattle slaughtering pen was stale and dead. To his right, the passage angled upwards to pass between 2 guard rooms. Beyond these lay the outer gate and the outskirts of Grail. There was no light from the gaping doorways of the guard rooms. The Torque had sufficient men stationed in the great court to believe themselves secure. No slave could climb the chimney unnoticed. There was no longer a need to post guards here. Lund reached for Rin's mind, telling him to move forward. The boy touched Brannick on the shoulder, and the procession fell in behind Lund. Noiselessly, they crept up the passage to the gate. It had been left open. The night was cloudless and damp. The stars seemed extraordinarily bright after their long sojourn underground. It was pleasing to feel the free movement of cold air over their bodies as they paced through the silent streets. Lund glanced behind him at the city gates leading to the easternmost running trails and the forest beyond. There were no guards posted here either. That was no surprise. Grail had no outside threat to guard against. How simple it would be to lead all the slaves out through the feeding pits, up the passage as they had come, and out into the forest. Now there was an opportunity to escape the dark underground, where they merely waited for slow death to overtake them. Should he not make the attempt? Would they ever catch the Torque off guard like this again? He sighed inwardly and kept going. There were too many young, too many weak ones. The destroyer was still here. If they were caught in the open, on the road north or plowing through the forest in any other direction, that irresistible horror would have his opportunity. There was but one place they were safe from him, the caverns that would see them slowly starve. The destroyer would have to be dealt with before they could think of escape along this route. He turned his mind back to the mission at hand. Where would the Torque keep the majority of their supplies? There were warehouses on the main route to the northern city gate. Formerly, the slaves had loaded carts there for the journey north. Everything from ore to cotton, tulle, and wheat had been kept there, awaiting transportation. Perhaps that was the best place to start. Once they reached the main street, an unexpected sight greeted their eyes. Carts and wagons lined the roadway in both directions, stretching past the warehouses and into side streets. Chests and bundles, furniture and household goods were piled on them, already lashed into place. Lund was reminded a little of the slaves' entry into Grail not so long before. Indeed, most of the carts now employed for this mysterious enterprise had arrived here then. The group stood staring with him, pressed into the shadow of the wall. What was happening? He felt Rin's incredulous thought.
They're all leaving.
That was it. The boy had to be right. The Torque, the Beaters, the tribesmen warriors, all their women and children were about to set out up the northern road. Grail was to be abandoned by its masters. Why should they linger in the slave city? They had lived off the forced labor of others, now to be exterminated. There was no reason to remain here. The city slept around them. Perhaps in the morning they would rise to start their journey. If he could help it, they would wake to consternation and dismay. Quickly he ordered Brith to send his standbys up to the streets. He would have to go back and fetch 100 more carriers from the hideout. An incredible opportunity had fallen into their laps. By morning the task was complete. Like a string of ants drawn to a honeypot, the line of Ron had dragged off clothing and implements, blankets and shoes, pots and cutlery, stripping the carts of anything they deemed useful. More importantly, what food supplies had remained in the warehouses was now safe within the tunnels. It was a gigantic haul, as welcome as it was unexpected. Every Vran household would receive something from the loot, except perhaps the raiders themselves. Lund saw Brennick and Rin reluctantly hand over warm clothing and blankets to Ceridwen's people. These items were needed in the nurseries and for older folk who struggled to stay warm without fires in the night. He caught them looking at each other dejectedly when a particularly inviting woolen blanket passed through their hands. While the collectors were occupied, he touched Brennick on the shoulder and motioned with his eyes. Quickly, the coveted item disappeared behind a rock, to be retrieved later. He had to shake his head at the look of undisguised glee on their faces. They probably smiled for the rest of the day. That night the troop would sleep warm and comfortable, huddled like puppies under their cover. For Lund, the greatest comfort was the thought of what anguish and distress he had caused their oppressors. He could sense the anger, the accusations, the indignation. Filthy slaves were handling their possessions, wearing their garments, drinking from their cups. Laughter rose up in him till he could burst with it. He did not laugh for long. The destroyer came down the chimney while they were sleeping. A lookout had heard the beating of its wings, and felt the paralyzing horror even before the dark bulk was properly visible against the pale starlight. Within moments the front cavern was a confusion of fleeing forms and young warriors whose boyish bravery was instantly stretched to the limit. Lund ordered them back in a loud voice, into the narrow passages beyond the reach of the beast. He retreated with them, herding the stumbling, sleepy forms as best he could. In the end, it was the size of the monster that prevented it from inflicting terrible losses on the running slaves. There was not enough room to beat its wings in the entrance to the cavern. It could also not secure a proper hold on the slippery ledge outside. Rather than risking a fall into the abyss below, the destroyer belched out a torrent of fire after them from the chimney. There were screams, and some were touched by it. Part of their firewood supply was set ablaze. There was nothing to be done while the beast hovered there. Lund stared at it in panic. What if the Torque soldiers would swing down their ladders and storm the cave now? They could fill the cavern in no time. He ordered the spearmen to prepare for a charge. The destroyer could not strike at them with fire while the Torque were in the way. He drew the blade and readied himself. Next to him stood Brennick, blade in one hand and clutching the blanket in the other. The tip of the blade was shaking, but he appeared quite resolute. Lund cringed inwardly to think that such a child would have to rush out and face the armored beast outside. But no soldiers came down that night. It had simply been a reminder that they did not have the upper hand, an angry reaction to the daring they had displayed. The destroyer retreated soon after, leaving them to count the cost. 9 of his front-line defenders had been slain or seriously injured, among them 2 of the branded slaves who had stood face to face with the Torque Lord and defied him openly in his great arena. They had not died without tasting that impossible freedom for which they had struggled in the dank wood. Bronn stood in silent groups about the bodies. These would not be ripped by animals or sliced up by the perverse hunters. For them there would be rituals of departure and open expressions of grief and appreciation. Friends would bear them to the funeral pyre and send them back to the air where their spirits had already gone. Lund ordered the miners to close up the entrance into the Roning lair. It was known now that they had a way out of their hideout. The Torque would search till they found it. The escape could always be reopened later if needed. In the meantime, the search for a tunnel leading into the forest would continue. Only one tunnel had not been crossed off with a double line on Prith's map. He wondered if it was worth exploring. It snaked away in the direction of the running pits, crossing over chasms and littered with obstructions. Even Brennick's intrepid troop had trouble negotiating it. Perhaps it was best to choose a different tunnel and start the mining that would lead to an escape. He would give them another day or 2. Lund decided to accompany the boys on the morning of their final day of exploration. Brennick had assured him that there was something in this broken tunnel. The boy had felt the moving of air in places and smelled something like rotting plants. It was a long and difficult trek. Lund considered turning back when crawling space became tight. The tunnel moved in the wrong direction. Besides, it would take forever to break a path all the way through, wide enough for the rest of the Vran. The boys pressed on him to carry on. Just ahead, they kept saying, he would notice the air. Sure enough, just after the going became a bit easier, he felt it. Unmistakably, the cold air swept over his sweat-covered body. He even imagined hearing the far-off soughing of the wind. There was an odor, too, unpleasant yet faint. In the distance he could hear the trickling of water. An opening, barely large enough for the passage of a small hare, seemed to be the source. Brennick wrinkled his nose.
The drain pit. I'll know that anywhere.
Lund was immediately interested.
The draining pit. We could reach the running pit from there.
Brennick stared.
The running pit.
He remembered.
We could find core.
Frantically, he clawed at the hole, trying to dislodge the stone blocking it. Lund lent him a hand. A large rock came loose in their hands. It seemed possible to enlarge the hole by working away the gritty soil at the bottom. He heard the sough again, and the stale smell washed over them. Brennick was gouging away the dirt fiendishly. Another rock moved. Lund felt the excitement too as the boy pushed his body into the gap. He remembered now the drainage tunnels they had dug in the new temple. Those were wide enough for the passage of a man, if they could find a connection with the draining pit. Brennick gave a little cry. He was standing upright on the other side of the hole. His voice echoed in the hollow space.
This is the pit. There.
He pointed upwards.
I sat on that ledge right there.
He was jumping up and down with excitement.
Luren! Luren, it's me!
Lund struggled to fit his shoulders through the hole. Somewhere above him a voice answered the boy's call. He forced his muscles to relax and not fight against the enclosing rock. Brennick was climbing the side of the pit, which seemed wet and extremely slippery. Lund wormed his way through and watched in exasperation.
Take care.
Brennick did not even look down at him. 20 feet above him, over a rocky ledge, a face peered down at them. It was Luren's. Rin appeared at his shoulder. He carried their rope ladder. Lund took it from him and started out after Brennick. Once he had reached the ledge, he would secure the ladder for the others. Excited voices awaited his arrival. He was suddenly apprehensive about what he would find here. If Luren's presence meant that Kor was somewhere in the vicinity, would the old man be alive still? Why had he been silent for so long now? Had the boy not merely cowered here to escape the fate of the other Vran? Luren grabbed him by the hand, as if he could not believe what he saw in front of him. Lund looked the boy over for signs of starvation or injury. When he was satisfied, he put a hand on his hair.
I'm glad you're safe. Is Kor...
He could not bring himself to say it. The boy slowly shook his head.
He's here. He has hoped to see you before.
His voice trailed off. He turned and motioned for Lund to follow.
This way.
Lund pressed the frail skeletal body to him. A silent sob rose up in his chest, till he felt he would choke with it, and spilled the tears from his brimming eyes. The old man held him in patient silence, smiling. The sound of his weak voice was like the touch of sunlight.
I dreamed of meeting you like this, on the day we would be free.
Lund swallowed back the upwelling of emotion.
You have been my life and my hope all this time.
He felt the slow, irregular beat of Kor's heart, the warm vibration of words against his cheek.
I am ready to depart. They are in your care now. Keep Luren with you. He has great talent.
Lund released him and rose up to look into Kor's failing eyes.
You cannot leave me. I am lost without your strength, your direction.
No, you are the strong one now. You are everything I dreamed you would be. My journey ends here, but I am not destitute as I thought I would be.
We can get you out.
Kor seemed not to hear him.
I wanted you to run all these cycles. I could not bear to see you hurt or killed like so many others. But I was selfish and foolish. You are a fighter. The fire of it is in you. Have I not witnessed it? And now the fighting time has come, and you have the arms for it.
The old man fell silent for such a long time that they grew concerned, and Luren leaned over him to see if he breathed still. But he spoke one more time, a whisper like the fading evening breeze in the forest before the settling calm.
I have lived to see you. I am content.
Kor leaned back against the stone and let out his last breath. His eyes were set in a far-off stare, as if he could see the land beyond the trees, where Vran were more than animals for the slaughter. His lips were formed into a faint smile. Luren said nothing. A sad frown contorted his face. His small frame was huddled beside the old man's body. Brennick stared from one to the other, as if he was looking for some sign that this was the end. His voice broke.
Easy.
The others nodded. The boy slumped down with his head pressed sideways onto the old man's chest, where there was no longer any sign of life. His eyes were wide and staring, but without tears. His mouth kept repeating the same phrase, but no sound came.
My father. My father.
And Lund knew it too. This was his father, and that of 1,000 more sons, the hopeless Vran boys who had run for their lives in Grail. Then there was pain, an agony of loss unbearable and unacceptable. Yet he knew with certainty, Kor had finally slipped the bonds of slavery and suffering.